Thanks very much for the invitation to join you here today, and can I first acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to elders past and present, acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues, Mitch, Clive and Nick, and thank you Stephen and CEDA for the invitation again to speak to one of your forums. I wanted to start briefly not with the current budget session or the current parliament, but at the very start at the constitutional conventions in the 1890s, because it is, of course, at those conventions that the Australian Senate was conceived. An idea derived from the United States, which also has a Senate which represents the interests of the states in a federal system. So our Senate was established to protect and promote the interests of smaller and less powerful colonies, soon to be states, in the new national parliament. It was seen as a counterweight to the People's House, the House of Representatives, where the more populous colonies, New South Wales and Victoria, would dominate with some 49 of the 75 seats in the first parliament. Samuel Griffith at the 1891 convention said, every law submitted to the federal parliament shall receive the assent of the majority of the people and also of the majority of states. So clearly, the smaller colonies were somewhat distrustful of the larger colonies. And in fact, that distrust you can see in the constitutional conventions because some of the delegates from the smaller, what became states, opposed the inclusion of a provision to resolve the deadlock between the houses, which of course is the double dissolution provision in our federal constitution. Now, it is true that from the outset, senators have tended to vote as representatives of parties rather than of states. However, the establishment of the Senate has ensured that in one of the two houses of parliament, the majority cannot comprise the representatives of just a couple of states. There may be people in the room who would prefer that, but that's not the position we've agreed to. So the powers that could be exercised by the Senate was one of the most contested issues in the decade leading to federation. Again, a contest between the big and the small colonies about how power would be shared. And the so-called Compromise of 1891 led to the Senate exercising most but not all of the powers exercised by the House. As you'd be aware, the Senate could not and cannot amend bills appropriating money for the ordinary annual services of government and bills imposing taxation. What it can do is amend other types of appropriation bills and request amendments to those bills it is prohibited from amending. Apart from this, in all other respects, the Senate is equal to the House. And possibly for this reason, it is described as the second most powerful upper house in the world after the US Senate. So why the brief history lesson? Well, because like it or not, our way of governing was designed by men, and they were, I think, all men, born in the first half of the 19th century. And the frustrations experienced by modern governments are a design feature, not an unintended consequence. So those expressing surprise that the current Senate has rejected measures proposed in the first Abbott budget would do well to recall that the first supply bill proposed in the National Parliament was returned to the House and resulted in the bill being laid aside and another sent more to the Senate's liking. Of course, I lead a party in the Senate that was the subject of a constitutional coup in 1975, and we recognise that Prime Ministers that enjoy the confidence of the House of Representatives enjoy the right to govern unencumbered by Senate action to choke the supply of money for the ordinary services of government. And I again reiterate, we remain the only party which has explicitly adopted such a position. But frankly, spare me the crocodile tears of the Abbott government and their Greek chorus when they complain about the current Senate holding the Prime Minister to his election promises. Promises which included, on the eve of the 2013 election, no cuts to education, no cuts to health, no changes to the pension, no changes to the GST and no cuts to the ABC or SBS. So if Tony Abbott wants to work out why those matters have not passed the Senate, perhaps he should reflect on his own promises, because broken promises have not passed this Senate because they are based on a dishonesty. So I will not stand here nor in any forum and apologise for Labor's opposition to the cutting of the indexation of age pensions, to the introduction of a Medicare co-payment, and to the government's plans to force young unemployed people to wait 6 months to access income support, or Labor's rejection of legislation imposing university fee deregulation, a plan to which the Coalition remains committed. Because if the Coalition had control of the Senate from the last election, pensioners would be poorer, more Australians would be denied healthcare, young unemployed people would be forced to endure grinding poverty, and $100,000 university fees would be a reality. Now, turning to the current Senate, we hold 25 out of 76 seats. Now, obviously those 25 votes have not been enough to prevent the passage of much of the government's radical legislative program. Mitch spoke about it quite proudly. I have a different view about the abolition of a sensible approach to reducing carbon, about the freezing of superannuation for millions of Australians, and about the scrapping of low-income superannuation contributions for our lowest paid workers, and about Australia walking away from its obligations under the Refugee Convention. But to the editorialists, conservative commentators and some in the business community who complain about Senate obstructionism, let's outline some facts about the current Senate. Since the 1st of July last year, when senators elected at the 2013 election took their seats, the Senate has rejected just 16 government bills, 10 of which were passed at a subsequent attempt, including a package of 8 bills related to the government's repeal of carbon pricing. 138 bills have passed the Senate since the 1st of July last year, including 13 bills last week. Those are the facts about the so-called obstructive Senate. I want to turn in conclusion to the matter of Senate reform. The Senate is obviously not the house where government is formed, but it does represent the people, albeit on a different basis to the House. And since 1949, we've been elected on the basis of proportional representation. As you know, what does that mean? It means that parties gain representation in proportion to their share of the vote. And this has led to the representation of both minor parties and independents in the Senate. It has also meant that parties, or a party which holds a majority in the House of Representatives, only rarely does so in the Senate. We should reflect on the fact that an overwhelming majority of Australians did not vote for the coalition parties in the Senate at the last federal election. 4.9 million first preference Senate votes were cast for candidates standing for the coalition, that is the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Liberal National Party and the Country Liberal Party. 8.5 million first preference Senate votes were cast for candidates not standing for the coalition, including 4 million first preference votes for Labor and 1.2 million first preference votes for the Greens. Now, I obviously would prefer that more people had voted Labor in the Senate. And I also know that the number of first preference votes received by some cross-party senators are small in number. But the 3.3 million Australians in 2013 who didn't vote for the Labor Party, the Coalition or the Greens are also entitled to representation, even if others may disagree with their choices. Mitch referred to reform of the Senate voting system, which seems to be a perennial topic. And there are many people from many parts of the political spectrum who would like to reform the system. And certainly there was, as Mitch said, a report of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters that was tabled, which made a range of recommendations. These are, if implemented, some of the most significant changes proposed in more than 2 decades. And so for this reason, Labor is proceeding cautiously. We are open to a constructive and open dialogue with different parts of the Parliament about these issues. I would make this point. As Senate Leader, I believe I have a particular responsibility to ensure Labor maintains our ability to campaign for and win seats in the Senate, so we can do what the millions of Australians ask of us when they entrust us with their Senate vote, to perform a check on executive government, to advance the cause of progressive reform, and to tackle a Conservative Prime Minister who wants to take this nation backwards rather than forwards. Thank you very much.